Um, Welcome to everybody on behalf of the Project for the Study of the 21st Century. My name is Ian Wallace. I am a senior fellow at New America and coincidentally the director of the Cybersecurity Initiative. We are here to discuss battlefields, technology, and business, which I'm going to take as code for a discussion really on the future of warfare and what we have, which will in itself include elements of battlefields, technology, and indeed business, as we'll discuss. This is a particularly topical issue for DC right now. Washington is abuzz with conversations about what the future of war is going to look like, despite and possibly because of a series of extremely depressingly persistent current wars that continue to be fought. But as we discuss this issue, it's worth reminding that just discussing what the future of war is going to look like doesn't necessarily mean that the people who are going to fight it are necessarily prepared for what they're going to face. And one of the things I think we want to dig into is exactly how governments and militaries are responding to the trends that are being discussed in these conversations. To have this conversation, I'm very pleased to be joined with two of the leading players in these debates, Peter Singer and Alex Ward, who I will introduce very quickly. Peter is also a senior fellow at New America. He's the organization's strategist and also the author of multiple award-winning books on subjects that range from cybersecurity, robotics, private military companies, child soldiers, and most recently, and highly relevant to this discussion, Ghost Fleet, a novel of the next World War. Peter is a contributing editor, Popular Science magazine, founder of his own technology company, Neo-Luddite. He works as the consultant to a number of organizations which range from the Defense Intelligence Agency and the FBI to media companies like DreamWorks, HBO, and the video game Call of Duty, which is the best-selling entertainment project in history. Alex also has a storied CV. He's the associate director of the Brent Scowcroft Center for International Security at the Atlantic Council, where he focuses on defense strategy, policy, and military affairs. Before he was at the Atlantic Council, he worked at the Council on Foreign Relations, the US Department of State, and Northrop Grumman. He has written for a wide range of publications: War on the Rocks, The Diplomat, US News and World Report, Real Clear Defense, and brings to this a significant amount of experience. To kick off the discussion, I'm going to start by asking Peter about your book. You have spent a large part of the last few years researching a book on the future of war. Interestingly, you decided to make it a novel rather than a non-fiction book. But just for the benefit of those people who may not have yet read it, can you just describe what vision you painted for the future of war and why you did that?
Sure, and thanks everyone for joining us here and online. So Ghost Fleet is, as the title says, a novel of the next World War, but it's a different kind of novel. It smashes together the format of a techno-thriller, an early Tom Clancy in style, but it also has 400 endnotes to document how every single technology that's in it, every single trend, even some of the things that the characters say are drawn from the real world. And it plays out the scenario of a great power war, a war between states in the 21st century, in the scenario a US-China-Russia war. But through that, it follows a cast of characters who might play a role in that war, and they were drawn from real-world characters. And so it plays it out. In many ways, it also shows kind of how the future of war may be different than the wars that we're fighting today, that we've weirdly enough grown accustomed to, even though they were once the abnormal, the counterinsurgency, small wars, and in turn, maybe potential adversaries think reveal a new American weakness. And by that, I'm getting at that it may be multi-domain. So for example, the U.S. hasn't fought a peer at sea for 70 years, hasn't fought a peer in the air for 70 years. Actually, U.S. forces haven't been bombed for more than 40 years. So you can see battles in the air, at sea, not just on the land. But also you might see battles in two places we've never fought before, in space and cyberspace. And so it uses the story of the war to explore that. Another aspect that's maybe different about the future of war is the proliferation of technology and high technology in lots of different players' hands. So the US, for example, for 70 years, we've been a generation ahead of any adversary. It's not meant we've always gotten victory, but it's been a good advantage to have, and it's shaped defense planning and the like. And that may not be the case whether you're talking about a high-end adversary like a China, or even the small groups like terrorist groups or ISIS. They're having access to technology that matches, or in some cases even surpasses, the kind of technology that U.S. forces have. There's a number of other differences, but I think those play out.
Just for color, a sense of some of those technologies that you identify that you think are going to change the way in which warfare is fought.
So again, I think there's a neat parallel with the period surrounding World War I, where there were a host of technologies back then that had recently been science fiction. The submarine, the flying machine, the land ironclad, which was the tank, later on H.G. Wells' concept of an atomic bomb. All of these were sci-fi. They all were introduced into war. And I think we're living through a similar period of a range of science fiction technologies, robotics, increasingly autonomous robotics, digital weapons, electromagnetic railguns, human performance modification. We can go artificial intelligence. All sorts of things apply into war that we're starting to see on the civilian sector, starting to see them in war, but in many ways they're just now starting to prove themselves, and they're not going to go away. They're going to be used in a mass scale. But there's a caveat to all of this. This is not a story of, oh, technology is going to solve all your problems. This is not the Rumsfeld Pentagon. New technology brings you incredible new capabilities. It brings you incredible new complications. Complications in everything from how you organize yourself to, oh, by the way, the other side might have the same technology or better, or they might be able to take out dependencies of that technology. So in the book, we play with everything from U.S. dependence on things like GPS, what would happen if GPS went down, the fact that our next generation fighter jet, the F-35, the most expensive weapons program in all of human history, actually has been hacked on at least 3 separate occasions we can document. It also is powered by microchips, a majority of whom are manufactured and designed in China and Taiwan. So we explore kind of the implications, the challenges, the risks of that. And oh, by the way, you may have stealthy battleships like the USS Zumwalt, which is on the cover of the book. That's a new ship under construction in Maine right now. It's essentially the equivalent of a battleship. It's classified as a destroyer, but it's really the equivalent of a battleship. It's powered by 4 million lines of Linux code, highly robotic in a lot of its operations. You may have technologies like that, but oh, by the way, the IED and the knife aren't going away.
One more question before I open it up to bring Alex in. We've covered battlefields, we've covered technology. The other theme that we're discussing today is business. And one of the themes that you pick up in your book is the changing nature of the relationship between government and the private sector. How do you think that's going to play out?
So if we think about the last time the great powers fought, I mean, frankly, our image of the defense industrial complex and the arsenal of democracy, it's these large, clearly national firms that are making the weapons of war. They're making goods. And the centerpiece of this used to be Detroit, and now it's maybe the DC Beltway. And yet the reality of today, let alone the future, doesn't match that. So if we're thinking about the players that might matter the most on the private business side, it will it's equally likely, maybe more likely, to be Silicon Valley, venture capitalists there, to multinational corporations. So in the book, we've got characters that range from Silicon Valley venture capitalists to think about the story of space today. Who's doing the most interesting things in space? It's not just defense companies. It's billionaires with a fascination of space. We have a character like that, again, drawn from the real world, to Bentonville, Arkansas, the home of Walmart, multinational corporation. And these companies will have questions about, if you're multinational, how you navigate these future wars when you're global. Which do you go with where you're founded? Do you go with where your headquarters is located? Do you go with where your primary business is? Do you go with where your shareholders live? That's not the kind of question that people were playing with in World War II. Another difference is private business used to, as I said, make the goods of war. Well, now when we look in war, they're primarily providing the service side of war too. The height of the Iraq War, we had more private military contractors in Iraq than we had coalition forces. I find it interesting today in Afghanistan, we're having this discussion on whether we should shrink the force from down to 10,000 and then down to 5,000, and should it leave or not. While according to the latest report, there are 35,000 private military contractors in Afghanistan. So we've grown comfortable, for better or for worse, with the Blackwater, so to speak, playing a role in the small wars of today. Why should we assume they won't play a role in both the small wars of tomorrow and the big wars of tomorrow? And this is not even to get into the other kind of private sector groups, which are not profit motivated private sector, but other players like, for example, in cyber security, it's not just companies that matter, it's not just the NSA that matters, it's the fuzzy groups in the middle. It's Chinese university cyber militia, the Russian business network, which is actually not a business, it's their organized crime network, which has also played a role in certain military operations in the Ukraine and Georgia wars. And then it's things like Anonymous, which are hacktivist collectives. They'll all play a role, are playing a role in war today.
Alex, you sit in Washington, analyze what the DoD is doing, what the DoD is getting ready for. First, I guess, do you buy into this picture that Peter is painting? But secondly, even if in detail you might not, do you think the DoD and others in the defense establishment are ready for what the future is bringing, whether it's new technologies or changing relationships with business, and how are they thinking about these changes that we're seeing?
Sure. So first of all, thanks again to all of you who are here and online. And although Peter won't say it, I'll say bye, go sleep. It's really good. So my first thought is, right now we're in the middle of what they want, what Pentagon wants, which is the third offset, which I find fascinating because it's actually our second adversary, right? The first two were for the Soviet Union, and now this is clearly about China. And the way we're going to solve this problem is by having Secretary Carter go out to Silicon Valley and say, we want your help. And I'm a little, I guess, skeptical about this for a few reasons. One is, I think the Pentagon needs Silicon Valley more than Silicon Valley needs the Pentagon. And I don't know how much resolve the Pentagon will have out there. I think the legacy of this entire push will just be having that appendage office out there and not much come out of it. You actually hear a lot of the CEOs in that region talk, and they are excited about the prospects of selling some products, but I don't think they think it's a long-term solution. At the same time, you look at the defense industrial landscape, and obviously it takes a really, really long time to get stuff produced or planned, produced off the ground and actually into usage. And the world that Peter's describing, which I buy 98% of it, is one that requires a lot faster production, a lot faster planning, a lot faster conception, and a lot closer links between the industry and government. And I think they're still very far apart. They set out requirements, and they say you have a year to do it. And even if the right requirement comes or the right program comes in, they'll probably wait the entire year before they actually look over the proposals. And that's a problem, because you might, sorry about that. You might actually get the thing you need, but you still have to wait for all the fair competition laws, et cetera, et cetera. And that makes sense to a certain extent, but if you're in a world where you need things very quickly, or if that's your solution at least to a specific problem, then you're going to have an issue because it's going very slowly. Of course, where DoD will win is in producing the big things, right, or requesting the big things. Silicon Valley, I think, is very good right now in producing the smaller stuff. No reason to think it can't go bigger, and will be bigger soon, as Peter described. But in this interim period, and of course, there's a lot of short terms between the long term. They're gonna have an issue because you still need the primes and the other regular defense contractors to get the stuff that the Pentagon requires, and yet they're not going to do it quickly. What I also find interesting is that even though the Pentagon knows the world that's coming, they know the threats that are on their way. They haven't done too much about it. You talk to folks about the future of urban warfare, right? 60% of humanity will live in urban centers and in littoral areas. And that's if you have to fight wars where people are, in theory, right? And if they're not even preparing for that, where they already know most of humanity will live, then they're already behind on a lot of other issues. So I guess what I would find, and picking up a bit of what Peter described, is you need to have a world, or at least a bureaucracy, which understands to have a closer link with the defense industrial landscape. It clearly doesn't, or if it thinks it does, its ways of connecting are outdated, and you need a more updated system to do that. And I'm a little upset because you would think in theory that you have the right 5 guys in place to do this work, right? You have Secretary Carter, you have Bob Wark as DepSecDef, you have Frank Kendall as Undersecretary for Acquisition, then you have John McCain and Mac Thornberry. And all of them, on separate occasions, have said, we're going to reform the defense industrial base. This is what we're going to do. Here's how we're going to do it. And Carter's clearly taken the lead, but what's ended up happening is it's been more oversight, more so than reform. And while they've produced some reform, right now it's a lot of, this is taking too long, this is costing too much, and that's their prerogative, that's their job in Congress. But if they actually wanted to reform this process to deal with the world that Peter describes, then they're not doing their job.
So I'm going to dig into that in a little bit more detail in due course. But first, let me take you back to something you said about having to fight where the people are.
Sure.
I'll bring Peter. Peter, the war that you paint, which is not necessarily a prediction, it's a possible future, actually steps away from the land wars of the last decade and a half, 2 decades, and suggests a great role actually for the Navy. Are we now moving away from a time where the Army is going to be the force that's sort of most in the fight, and moving to an era where the Navy and the Air Force are more engaged?
I'm going to fight you on that assumption. So in the book, and again, the book, as you hit it, it's a work of fiction, not prediction, but it does set up a realistic world drawn from current trends, and whether it's urbanization, National Intelligence Council reports, et cetera. And so it lays out a future where it's interesting, when we were writing the book a couple years ago, this prediction seemed a little bit more out there, but we were imagining a world where the U.S. would be re-intervening into the Middle East, where the lessons of the Iraq War would have been passed over. And it took not a decade for that to happen, but about a year. So that continues in the world that we project. But secondly, is the scenario is looking at a U.S.-China war. The Pacific is mostly water. Now, if we have a plan to invade China, the lessons of history and some of the best movies tell you not to commit a land war in Asia, for Princess Bride fans there. So yes, it is by sheer geography, a conflict between the US and China would have a core naval, air, space, cyberspace element. But the story, and again, I think the real world side would not ignore land warfare. We have it, we just flip the script. So in the story, there is a insurgency. It's just Americans are behind enemy lines. And we use that as a way of exploring a couple things. One, what are the lessons that we've learned from the last roughly 15 years of fighting insurgencies? And this was taken from conversations with special operations and the like. So what have we learned? Second, it gives you a way of playing with the tools and tactics that the other side has used against us, and how do we think about the morality of them when the shoe's on the other foot. And also it's the other side having the debate that we've been having of no, it's about taking out leaders, crushing them down. No, it's about winning hearts and minds. And there's even a version of a PRT in it, just it's on the other side. So it's happening, it's just we're not us in that script, and it's a way of looking at it through a different lens. There's also an urban side. In the story, it follows an individual who's basically a cross between a murderer and an insurgent, again, depending on what you think. They're in an urban zone. The adversary is using all the tools that we either have right now and are using right now in both war, i.e. things we've used in Baghdad and Kabul, and or things that have moved over to the civilian side in regular policing. So everything from mass surveillance in the city, overhead drones, cameras everywhere, to rapid DNA identification, which again was something that was developed for the military and then has moved over to the police side. And so this individual, the police and occupying force have these tools, and yet the individual is still able to carry out their crimes because the urban setting gives you lots of different ways to work around it. So it doesn't ignore it. And again, I agree, war is a human endeavor. Wars, we can't project where on the map the next war definitely will take place, but I think we can project that it will have highly urban elements to it. And we're even seeing that right now in Syria, where Syria is a great example of different meta trends coming together. It's everything from climate change. Syria started experiencing one of its worst, if not the worst, drought on record starting in 2006, which not just led to food shortages, but led to 1.5 million Syrians moving from farms to cities. And that led to a bunch of unrest, upset, and the very first protests. And then the regime crushes the protests, and you get the spark of the war. So the story of big meta trends of urbanization or climate change, they do feed into conflict. And this is not something we're waiting for the 2030s to happen. We're already seeing some of these things happen now.
So Syria actually provides a great bridge to my next question, which is about the prospect of great power conflict. And this is a question for both of you. Your book is clearly based on the premise that we haven't seen the end of great power conflict. We've become very used to small or if not limited wars. And your book suggests that we may be involved into a false sense of security. Now we have Russia moving into Syria. We have once again two nuclear powers operating in the same space, and all of the potential risks that come with that. Tell us a little bit more about your thinking, Peter, on the prospects for great power war, and then Alex, give us your sense of where we stand in that. So
we need to get to go. So think about it this way. The 20th century was defined by great power conflict. We had 2 world wars that cost tens of millions of lives. We had the fear of a third world war that shaped everything from the geopolitics of the Cold War to how we understood international sporting competitions. And then with the fall of the Berlin Wall, the start of the 21st century, conflict didn't go away, but it was seemingly pushed down a level. So we stopped worrying about powerful states and rising states, and we're worried about fragile and failed states. And again, it's not just kind of generic discussion in media, like you can see this in all the various strategy documents of the QDR. And it shifts from being about powerful state armies or navies to transnational networks of individuals, of terrorist criminals, insurgents. And this also is parallel in academia, where, for example, just 4 years ago, a very prominent Harvard professor wrote a book and then also had a article in the New York Times that basically argued that the era of war between states was over. And the article in the New York Times put it this way: it said, war has gone out of style. If only it would. And I think we're seeing this reemergence of great power, certainly competition, if not proxy conflict, and then the fear is real conflict. So, both the US and Russia have identified each other in law and by statements as the other's #1 threat, to quote. We equally see an arms race in the Pacific between the US and China. The offset that he spoke about is to offset the fact that China has built more warships or warplanes than any other nation in 2012, 2013, 2014, 2015, planning to do so 2016, 2017. You get the picture. So there's this competition there, the rhetoric's there. Now, how could a war actually start? Again, looking back at the 20th century, one world war started through a very deliberate set of choices. The other was basically a crisis that spun out of control. The same thing today. We could have an accident, 2 planes accidentally bumping together. That would never happen over, a nation like Syria right now, or South China Sea, or it could be warships scraping paint over a reef that isn't even on a nautical chart. And again, in the discourse today, there's the artificial islands that are built, and then the whole that the U.S. should exert rights of passage. So, or maybe it's allies that draw you in. Maybe it's not U.S. or UK or China or Russia directly. It's Japan and China. Again, that's a World War I parallel. Or it's deliberate choices, if not now, some point in the future, to reorder geopolitics on their or our terms. The essence of deterrence actually working is that both sides wake up in the morning and say, this is not the day to go to war. If I do, it would be horrible for me and I would lose. The problem, the risk, is that both military leaders and civilian leaders are caught either in the scenario, either in the thinking of, no, it could never ever happen, which is again parallel with people prior to World War I, or, well, if it happened, I'd be the one that would do it. And you can see this again in the rhetoric and the polling and the like. And so that's a dangerous brew, whether the scenario is accident or deliberate choice.
Alex, does that ring true? I mean, do you think the leaders, particularly in the United States, have their mind around the sort of wars that they may have to fight in the not too distant future?
Well, I want to quickly pull on one thing, which is I think Peter's right that deterrence is what you're going to need going forward. I just think it's really hard to do now because you're deterring so many possible things. And on top of that, when you're talking about great power war, which will require the U.S. almost by definition, it might not start with us, right? It could start with Pakistan, India. It could start with China, Japan. It could start in a whole bunch of other areas that are a bit outside of our control. And so if you're trying to deter World War III, you might not even actually have the ability to deter the start of World War III because it's not happened to America. And this is where you start getting to the arguments of that America has to be everywhere and help control a whole bunch of things. It would be nice, but it's really near impossible to do. But when, again, I caution, when we talk about great power war, the assumption is the U.S. and Russia are angry about something, they bump planes over Syria. Who could ever think of such a situation? And then that starts. But of course, it could go elsewhere. And while I guess I would say, I think great power war is obviously still a possibility. I think it's less of one than we probably conceive it to be. But I also want to caution that it's incredibly hard to do. We've been lulled into thinking that war can start pretty easily, because the U.S. lately has been fighting a lot of really easy enemies, so to speak, in terms of getting to the battlefield. Right? They don't have anti-access, area denial kinds of things. You show up to Iraq, you get into Baghdad, and you're all set. Of course, there's a whole governance aspect after that, but you get my point. When it comes to military affairs, right? If you have an adversary that can actually stop you from getting to where you need to go, the war ends up quickly. And so there's almost a bit of a niceness to the fact that China can deter us from going in, to put it in a very crude way that will probably get me in trouble with my boss later. But I also want to caution again, just because you can send a tweet and call around the world and do what you can does not mean you can get the military equipment you need there. So there's even a deterrence in how hard it is to conduct great power war that might actually make it less likely.
So I want to come back. It's remarkable to me in some ways that this conversation has continued for half an hour and no one has mentioned nuclear weapons. For half a century or more, nuclear weapons have been the thing, or held to be the thing, that has prevented great power war and the mass casualties that people saw in the Second World War and First World War before that. Peter, you wrote this book of a war between two nuclear powers. How confident are you that the nuclear taboo would prevent a nuclear exchange in the circumstances like the one you wrote down?
Well, there's a couple of reasons why, and again, spoiler alert, it's not a book about a nuclear war. One is it would be a very short book. And otherwise I would have to make it longer, add like zombies at the end, post-apocalyptic or whatever. But more seriously, there's layers to this. So one is that nuclear weapons were not the fire break during the Cold War that actually we like to think that they were. We are quite fortunate that we didn't go to war on a number of occasions, despite having them. Sometimes there were occasions where we kind of knew we were close to war, but we didn't know how close we were to war. The Cuban Missile Crisis, so when we knew that was a point, that was a crisis. But when we've opened up the archives afterwards, it's like, wow, this was a lot closer than anyone thought. There were other times that we didn't even know that we were almost at war. So, for example, there was the NATO exercise in 1983 that the Soviet Union was firmly convinced was about to be a preemptive strike, and it maybe should kick off the war instead. And only through the actions of a couple of Red Army officers did they not take that move. There's also the accidents, not just miscalculations. So a good illustration would be when the USS Kitty Hawk, an aircraft carrier, it bumped, it scraped with a Soviet Victor-class submarine, both of them with nuclear weapons on board. Fortunately, neither went off, but you can imagine how different the story of the Cold War would have been if an American carrier had detonated a nuclear explosion. I mean, this was almost the accident that happened. So the point is, one, in history didn't prove to be the fire break. Two, we back then had various, despite being nuclear powers, plans to fight in a conventional means and to try and keep it below that level. Just like today, all the various sides, despite having nuclear weapons, have plans to fight. So we play in the book with the idea of, will that be possible or not, and what kind of signaling will you have to do, where it creates very, at face value, strange approaches where you may not take out targets of mine, so that by signaling to me, hey, I'm fighting you, but let's keep this below going nuclear. So you may not take out certain command and control facilities or certain submarines, even though it'd be useful. It's a way of saying, no, let's keep this in just a nice regular war. So we know both sides have that kind of planning going on. Now, whether it will hold true is a different situation. You also have very different attitudes about the wars, and as you mentioned, the weapon itself, the taboo. So it was much easier for leaders, both military and civilian, to contemplate using these weapons in the 50s and 60s. They're talking about, oh, we'll win a nuclear war. I mean, that discourse is not there now. The stakes in a lot of the wars may not be the same level where you would accept the exchange of I'll lose San Francisco, but I'll show the other side. That kind of discourse isn't there anymore. But finally, so there's a little bit of a question of would people have the willingness to press the button the same way? Finally, you have the cross with cyber conflict. In the Cold War, you didn't have the ability of the other side to get inside your communications and change the information that you're receiving. So again, spoiler alert, but in the book, the president's not finding out about the war until the first battle of the war is over. So it changes the use of escalating nuclear weapons from a preventative, preemptive, or responsive to just, this is revenge after the fact that's going to get my own cities nuked. It's too late. But it's not just the information coming in may not be reliable. Your information going out may not be reliable. So you didn't have the question back during the Cuban Missile Crisis that if Kennedy said, let's press the red button, would that actually happen, or has someone else gotten inside the networks who will not only prevent it from happening, but take the fact that they know I've made that decision as a way to legitimize them acting back, preempting. So it's far more complex to the good old days of two powers, weapons that both sides could exist in a mutual assured destruction scenario. It's very different. Everything I just said, in no way, shape, or form interpret that as meaning there is not a risk of nuclear conflict, either between great powers or lesser powers that have these weapons, that something could escalate and get out of control. Again, whether you're talking about an India, Pakistan scenario, or even unexpected exchanges like an Iran-Pakistan scenario where they've not gamed it out, but you can quickly see border clashes getting in weird directions.
There's a lot we can get into there, and I think we'll leave it for Q&A. But Alex, another thing that I think Peter picks up in his book, but is a much wider issue generally, is the issue of alliances. Mm-hmm. And the extent to which the United States can depend on its allies, and the extent to which its alliance structures are designed for a world that just ceased to exist. How, given all of the technology trends that the United States is sort of moving ahead of even its closest allies in terms of the technology, how well constructed do you think the alliance structures that exist, and how do they need to adapt to take into account new technologies, changes in business relationship, changes in countries of parts of the world that wars may happen?
Sure. So we'll take us at a bit 30,000 feet. I mean, I think at the state level, the U.S. has the right alliances in place. It's hard to see it changing too much between now and 2030, or even out, I think, to 2050. I think it does a bad job is partnering with, to use the catch-all term, non-state actors. It does a really bad job of working with NGOs and working with technology companies and a whole bunch of other entities. And it's going to need to, because they're going to be at the forefront of solving a lot of the future problems. And so if you, of course, have the state architecture, you're also going to need the sub-state architecture. And that's what I think that you start to see more and more, at least the White House has mentioned that they want to do this. Other agencies are starting to reach out a bit more. So I think you're almost having a change from a superpower alliance structure to a super partner alliance structure, where the U.S. really wants to be the organization or the entity that becomes the hub of a bunch of spokes. With its tech, the U.S. government wants to be involved in tech and be the kind of place you go to coordinate. If it's humanitarian relief, U.S. government can help there too, and be the coordinator and talk to folks, and in a way can slide as much, lead from behind as much as it wants. I hate that term, but you can use it, or lead from a front as much as you want, and it can choose to partner in many which ways. But I think that's what it's lacking and what's trying to rectify. I'm cautious though, or I guess skeptical, I should say, that's going to do that in time, because you're already seeing, Peter mentioned, the 2030s are kind of already here, right? The megatrends that we've been worrying about are showing up and rearing their head, and we're still in a very Goldwater Nichols type world or setup. So you almost need a Goldwater Nichols 2 to set up not only, again, your state alliances, which will remain essentially the same, I think, but change at the sub-state level.
I want to press you on that, because let's say we went back in time and it was 1976, and we could have made a similar argument, and yet think about how much we would have gotten wrong. So in 1976, who would have made the projection that yes, we'll be working tightly with Ukraine against Russia, because there'll be a proxy war there. Vietnam, which we were just chased out of, will actually be a core centerpiece of our alliance building strategy. Iran, Iran is our major adversary, and we're troubled as to whether they're going to go nuclear or not. Remember, in '76, we're almost helping them do this. To our allies, the EU, it'd be hard to contemplate that. To, oh, by the way, we're really close to seeing Scotland go independent. I mean, you never would have gotten that. So this kind of challenges to when we assume that these trend lines will stay the same. We should look back at the history and go, gosh, yes, Japan was an ally then, Japan's an ally now, and we could maybe, but there's a lot of other things that could change.
No, and there's no question about that. I guess I'll amend my statement a bit to say that the U.S. was willing to work with whoever wants to work with it, right? We built this liberal world order. We want people to play a part in it, right? These are the rules of the game. You're with us or against us, so to speak. And so, yeah, Ukraine, Vietnam were against, but now they go, we want to work this way, and so we'll find a way to make it happen. And as a Catalonian citizen myself, my mom's from Barcelona, you could have seen Catalonian separatism happening since 1714. Scottish separatism since Braveheart came out, at least. So obviously, a lot of these trends we will get wrong, but at least they're trends for somewhat of a reason. You get at least an idea, and as long as you have a trend line of best fit, you'll at least figure yourself out. But I agree with you. Your historical examples aren't fair. But again, I think the operating system of the U.S. is, you want to work with us, we'll make it happen, and that's where I think it's starting to do it again at that sub-state level.
So let's quickly pivot, and we can come back to some of these issues when we move to Q&A. We touched briefly on technology. Technology isn't everything, but it is an interesting way of looking at how rapidly things can change. Peter first. Of the technologies that you identify, Ghostly, or other ones that you study, which do you think we're least prepared to incorporate into future warfare?
I think the area that we understand the least and are least willing to wrestle with is the cross between genomics, biotechnology, human performance modification. As astounding as all the things going on in the IT space and the outreach, as was mentioned by the Pentagon to Silicon Valley, the people in the biotech world, they look at Moore's law as slow. And it is, when you look at breakthroughs, copyrights, it's moving at a much faster pace. And it's an area that you're really talking about changes in us, and that makes it uncomfortable. And so I think that's one that we're really not yet kind of wrapped around what it truly means. It also goes against a lot of the things that we like to think about. We're so good because of our people. The human will always be at the center. Human centric. I mean, all of these things. But what happens when you start to modify the human? What does that mean? Or the tried and true ideas of like the OODA loop, which is the decision making more observe. But what happens when we're able to shape the human capacity to observe, orient, decide, analyze? So that's the one that I don't think we've got a good enough handle on, and it's also the one that rightly we wouldn't want the military to take the lead in, but as a result, it may in turn be the one, to your point about surprise and falling behind. It may be the one that the U.S. is most likely to fall behind in because of a very I think kind of ethical approach of saying, no, the military shouldn't be in this. I mean, you can see very different approaches to what people have been willing to do in various genetics research, biotech, and there are very different approaches to it in different countries. And human testing, there's a lot of boundaries that we've not been willing to cross as nations, let alone the military, that you may see others cross.
So two questions there, Alex. One is, how do big bureaucracies like the US military come to terms with these challenging new technologies, and how can the military position itself to adapt to a future that it really doesn't understand? And secondly, to pick up Peter's point, Peter may want to come on this, if not the US, who else is going to be in a position to exploit these opportunities? And partly because my questions have been very US centric, but who around the world is beginning to think of these in the way that should make us wake up and pay attention?
Sure. Well, I want to quickly echo what Peter said. I think the biotech piece is the most important, and the one I think we're behind. The chance for a bio-error or bioterror, for example, to use buzz terms, they're pretty high. We are now writing we're writing the code for life, so to speak, now. It's a completely different world in that space, and the chance for that the chance for something to go completely wrong is extraordinarily high. And he also mentioned the ethics of it. I mean, I think the US will be restricted in advancing in this space because we feel a bit weird of it and it seems unethical. Whereas I think, to your question, China's going to be leading in this, because I think it's about at least hundreds, if not thousands, of universities where they're actually have these biotech centers just learning how to advance the science. You're the expert on China, having written about its future, so I'll let you talk to that. But I would be shocked if it's not China. And the EU has the same ethical thoughts, so the same values, if you want to use that. But they are also doing lots of scientific work that's very interesting, especially in Munich. So I worry about biotech, and then I worry about our self-imposed restriction, because we're going to fall behind due to our own collective values and psyches.
Peter, before we open up, adaptability, it's the bureaucracy that has been designed to deliver today's wars going to work against the ability to fight the future wars?
Yes, I mean it's already worked against us in the current wars. We have a system in everything from its overall organization to how it recruits and retains personnel that essentially reflects the best of 1940s, and it was a great design, but it doesn't match well today. You can see this where we applaud Secretary Gates. He's not everyone, but such a fantastic SecDef, such a change agent and the like. And the thing that we're applauding, the primary case of success is that he was finally able to force through the system a truck that had been designed by South Africans in the 1970s and 80s, the MRAP, and that we could get enough of them out. No, by the way, leaving aside the fact that we've just left a couple thousand MRAPs, but the success story of and then it took a SecDef to do that. Let alone we are having a high tech discussion. It took his personal focus and energy for well over a year to get enough up armored trucks out there, not a high tech new technology. To the people side of it, again, there's a mismatch between. It's not a millennial. There's a mismatch of Gen Xer interests and identities and how they work. So I think we already see that. Now, all that said, there's still various advantages that are baked into the system. So one, I said, recruiting problems. On the other hand, it is an incredibly talented pool, and by all measures, they've found a way to recruit people that are smarter, physically more adept, and then it's able to train them to higher levels of graduate school and the like. It has a system that allows debate, maybe not as much debate as we want, but debate inside the military about different doctrines, debate with civilians, and engagement. It is maybe not as much as we want. It's a learning organization, and that may make it able to adopt, even though it's got structures that sometimes hold it back.
If I can real quick, I mean, the current military doctrines that are coming out seem to be somewhat on point. They're looking at this. They understand that they need new tech, or they understand that there's going to be a different operating environment. The doctrines are somewhat there. I've actually been quite impressed with them lately. I just don't think they're going to follow on them. I don't think they're going to be able to live up to their expectation, which has been the history of military doctrines and what they pull out. I'm interested in this Force of the Future initiative that DoD is putting out, right, to get the right people in, to bring all the new STEM skills that it needs. I'm just not sure they're going to be able to pull it off. They have massive challenges. They've never had the challenge of having, millennials who look at their phones an average of 610 times a day. They've never had an uneducated amount of recruitables they've ever as of now, compared to the skills that they want. They've never had such a connected environment where if you're on Facebook right now, I'm at the age where every time I go on Facebook, someone's getting engaged. Now, if you're in the military and you're 21 to 27 and you're constantly checking Facebook or Twitter, you're realizing that you're out now on your 8th tour somewhere else, and it's too high. But you're not living the life that your other friends are. And you never really had that before. You were getting letters, but that was a little different. So how do you get the new and improved super troop when they're not even living up before recruitment to get to what you want? And that's not only going to hinder the military's hopes for incorporating all this new stuff now, but into the future, because this crop now, 20 years from now, they're going to be those 05s, 06s that are leading the troops out there, and I'm not sure they're going to have the wherewithal at the time. Final point is military education to me is a scam. I mean, they do great work. They're great professors. They're great folks, but a master's at one of the military schools is just really not as good, I would argue, as they are in other liberal arts or other institutions. And so it would actually be up to the military to take all this new information and distill it in such a way that the soldiers, airmen, whatever it may be, can understand all this stuff. And I'm just not sure they'll be able to pull off those curriculums as well as other universities. So how do you incorporate all this? How do you teach this new generation of fighters to do what it needs to do? And I'm not sure they'll be able to do.
We might want to dig into that. There's also a lot of social media and future warfare, which we can also dig into. But I do want to from people around the table. Who has a question on any aspect of the battlefield, business, or the technology sides of the future of war? Could you identify yourself, where you're from, and then ask your question?
Hi, yeah, my name's Colby Ferlin, over at the East West Center here in Washington. I just had a question right off the beginning when we were talking about Silicon Valley and Pentagon approaching them for technological advancements, and I was kind of brushed off as, they get excited about it, but it's something we're not likely to see. I was curious about why that's not something we're likely to see become a big issue. I mean, they're in it for business, and I mean, the U.S. defense budget is massive. You would think that I would guess that they would be more than happy to play a major part in defense technology.
So, Alex, you were the one who was a bit skeptical about that. Sure. What was behind your skepticism?
So I don't think that they're not excited. I mean, I think they hope that this outreach is real. I just am skeptical that the outreach is. I mean, a lot of the companies that are currently making a lot of our systems have factories in almost all of the congressional districts. Those out in Silicon Valley have it in just their district. So they have a long way to go in order to get the contracts that they might want to get, or that could actually solve a lot of the military's problems. And there's just an entrenched bureaucracy, an entire game that goes against them. That's not to say that they can't pull it off. It's just going to be very difficult. And I'm just not sure the Pentagon will have the intestinal fortitude to stick it out year after year after year to actually see this through. I think this is a Secretary Carter move and a DepSec work move, and I applaud them for it. I think it's the right thing to do, but will it sustain over the amount of years you need it to in order to succeed? I'm just not sure.
I'd throw out there's at least three challenges they've got to overcome, but it doesn't defeat the value of the approach. So the challenges, one is the margins. These are companies that, a 4% profit is not going to do it. And these are companies, so the kind of the different way of putting it is the Pentagon or the government contracting system and the kind of profit margins that are offered within it are not exciting to a lot of these companies. The second is the timeline. So, in this area, you've got to show progress rapidly. There's startups that move quickly, that are created quickly. They succeed quickly or they fail quickly. The Pentagon system is not one, between the time when the Pentagon announced it and then actually created the office out there, think of how many hundreds, if not thousands, of companies were created and disappeared in Silicon Valley just in that period of time. So, and to your point of, even the contract competition of, oh, that's a great idea, we'll decide on in 12 months, that's a company, that's a time for a company. That somewhat relates to, I mentioned they fail quickly. The behind this is also the sort of a risk, how, why you need the high profit margin, why you need the quick turnaround is a risk mentality that's different than the DC Pentagon risk mentality. So, the idea that well over 9 out of 10 of the projects will fail, that's considered utterly normal there. Here, that's not something that is considered normal or applaudable, and certainly Congress would not be psyched by. The third is the thing that is the Voldemort issue. Just in this case, it's China. Neither party is willing to say this is about China. The Pentagon is reaching out to Silicon Valley because it's worried about losing a technology race, a new arms race with China. In turn, the major players in Silicon Valley, there's only so much they're going to embrace the Pentagon because, oh, by the way, to succeed, they need the China market. And that's just the reality of it. And so those factors are the challenges. All that said, it doesn't mean there's still not value in it. There's incredible value in the outreach. One is just frankly to build awareness on the Pentagon side of some of the incredible, interesting things that are happening there, so that you're able to demand that, even if you're demanding it of the same old companies that you were dealing with before. We could see this previously, the discussion over smartphones. You mentioned smartphones, how many times they check them. There was a point in time a couple years ago where the defense contractors were saying, first it was, we can't build you these. Then it was, well, we can build you, but they'll be roughly $1 million per. And then it was, oh, actually, wow, you just figured out how to retool an Android for it. And so it gives, one, it's an awareness. Two, maybe the big companies aren't interested, but some of the smaller companies maybe. So you get a lot of interesting things out of them. So you may not do a huge ton with Google or Facebook or whatever, just to name random names, but there may be a lot of interesting small companies that you can work with. And third, and I think this is actually behind a lot of the push by Carter and others, they're doing it as much to signal to the DC Beltway company, the old defense contractors. They've probably arguably taken a little bit too much delight in kind of sticking it to them. And you can see there's a lot of upset on the defense contractor side. It's sort of like, we've been in this long-term relationship and you're flirting with these people, you're flirting with this California, girl or boy. Why are you doing that? And you're going to come back to me eventually. That's kind of the discourse here, but there is a little bit of this. They're doing it as much to signal to, we could get other places. We can get innovation elsewhere. Now, whether that's true or not, whether that's the right thing, and they've kind of walked back from the tone, but there was clearly what I'm getting at, there was a messaging part of them doing this as much as like the actual outreach.
And just very just small point on that. Don't think two things just on that. One, don't think his last point's right. Don't think that the large contractors haven't gotten the message, because recently Wes Bush gave a speech where he was talking about a different subject, but he basically said this outreach to Silicon Valley is not going to work out in the long term. You're going to come back to companies like mine and Lockheed, et cetera. And it's important. You know, we're already talking about the difficulties of new companies getting into this market. There are already tons of small boutique defense contractors that DoD already has good relationships with. They're having trouble making other arrangements. So you have already entrenched larger guys, the entrenched smaller guys, and now you're trying to bring in a completely new company in. Granted, they may have a mega capability that the military can't get elsewhere, but it's still going to be really hard to break into that system.
Other questions?
Yeah, Ken Myers, I'm a retiree. I'm chaperoning the event, so you kids behave yourself. How does warfare in space fit into future scenarios and related weaponry like directed energy weapons?
Peter.
Short answer, buy the book. Long answer, definitely both play a role. And I think it's interesting to kind of pull back in history of this. You know, the last time the great powers fought, there was a young scientist who came up with the concept of putting artificial, what we call satellites into space and using them for communication. Arthur C. Clarke went on to become a more famous science fiction writer, but he's coming up with that concept at the end of World War II. That concept now, you know, we've got literally thousands of artificial objects in space. Through them runs the lifeblood of both civilian and military communications, intelligence gathering, you name it. So the simple point is, if there was a war between great powers, it would inherently involve space in some way, shape, or form, and most likely it would involve actual conflict in space. We're already preparing for it. China has conducted a variety of anti-satellite missile tests, including one that created a large amount of more artificial objects up there that are dangerous. If you've seen the movie Gravity, that's the example of space junk. Russia has reportedly restarted one of its Cold War programs, the Istrabel Sputnikov, I believe is how it's termed. It's basically a killer satellite program. The U.S., our hands are not clean either. We recently, in the budget, dedicated $5 billion towards space warfare capabilities and monitoring of Russia and China. So, and to your second question, the weaponry on Earth, we're seeing the introduction. This actually sort of like you're asking kind of new cool technologies. Directed energy, for all of human history, we used a physical object, a physical thing of some sort for the weapon. Your fist, the stone, a missile. Now we're seeing the introduction of energy as a weapon, not fueling, not powering the weapon, but as the weapon itself. We're seeing that on Earth. Again, not science fiction. We've already seen the introduction of lasers to certain U.S. Navy ships that are deployed to the Persian Gulf right now. And potentially you could see that deployed into space. It's a weapon that's well suited for that environment. And in the book, we play with that.
Sure. I mean, I guess we shouldn't lose sight of the point that we use space for warfare or our stuff every day, right? GPS, ISR, all that, you need it constantly. And so if anything goes wrong, it's spoiler, some things do in the book, it causes a lot of problems for your troops on the ground should you be in a constant battle. I'm going to draft Ghost Space Fleet for a second. Peter's co-author, August, works at the Atlantic Council with me, and we hosted an event which was using fiction to illuminate. We have the Art of Future Warfare series, quick plug, where we use fiction to illuminate ideas of future of warfare. And we did a contest on what would a space warfare look like in the world of 2090. One of the conclusions that really stuck out at me, and it was one of those things that seemed so obvious, but it put a fine point on it, was we're talking about huge tech and all the kinds of things you might need in space, but really you kind of just need to brick through a windshield because the environment of space will take care of that for you. So obviously you need all the large tech and the smart guys to get stuff up there to make it work. But in terms of the damage you need to create, you just kind of have to cause a small little problem to create an even bigger effect as gravity. And if you haven't seen it yet, The Martian could attest.
There's also to the prior discussion of Silicon Valley, one of the new technologies that is highly disruptive in everything from communications to maybe conflict is CubeSats, where the big defense contractors presently make massive, highly expensive satellites, and we're seeing now though the microsats, including ones where we've even seen another game-changing technology is 3D printers. So not what you make, but how you make it. And so we've seen the deployment of a 3D printer into the space station, which opens up the possibility of you actually manufacturing small, tiny satellites in space. CubeSats are about this big. And so one of the scenarios, it's not in the book, but from a recent defense conference I was at, is that a president, one of the first things they may do at the start of a conflict or the fear of a conflict is, okay, let's populate the sky overhead with a flotilla of these little tiny cheap satellites. So it's not I've got to wait for my spy satellite to come back in position, or I need to set up a communications network on the ground in Iraq. It's, I'll just flood the space overhead. Oh, by the way, that's also a variety of Silicon Valley for delivering the internet to the roughly half the planet that doesn't have the internet right now.
Quick comment on the Silicon Valley.
Just if you could identify yourself.
Oh, sure. Sean, I work in financial services. I think the business proposition of a Silicon Valley firm doing business with the government, I think, depends on the product itself. So software, for example, once you've put up the cost to make a piece of software, you can replicate it for no marginal cost. And I think that very much explains the success of companies like Palantir, whose main client is the government. And then moving over to the space, I think it was George Friedman in his very amusing book, The Next 100 Years, who predicted that part of the space conflict will always be driven by the race to mine asteroids that contain raw materials that we could use to make advanced weaponry. I was wondering how plausible you think that is. You have companies like Planetary Resources, whose sole purpose is to mine asteroids.
So I go to I already referenced in one of Arthur C. Clarke. Anything that's more than a generation ahead, you're not playing in the realm of educated science fiction or analysis. You're playing in the realm of magic. And so, whether it's the 2090 project, it's cool to contemplate it, but I mean, it's just too. I mean, I'm just pleased you guys thought we were alive then.
That was assumption one.
The Friedman, next 100 years. Let's be clear here. This is also the same guy who had a book entitled "The Coming War with Japan." Doesn't talk about that. That was in the early 90s when that was the trend. Then had another book that came out prior to 9/11 that predicted the coming American century, and that the coming American century we would dominate the world because we had the Tomahawk missile. Oh, by the way, then 9/11 happens and all those projections fall by the wayside. So these kind of industry of long-range futurism, it's not a great value proposition except for the futurist. So kind of leave it at that. The example of software and Palantir, it's a good one, but it's also interestingly, it's a great example of how companies can thrive if they figure out how to work the system. On the other hand, Palantir would be the first one to say this was not an easy process for them. And they didn't just show up with a great product and everyone went, "We love you." You know, there's been a just massive amount of churn and lobbying, and you've seen it play out in the press. So it's not been an easy journey for them. Second, it's hard to think of a number of other companies. I can think of lots of other companies that have created apps for dating. It's hard to think of lots of other Silicon Valley defense software companies. So they may be a great example, but then we have to wonder, is this a large N set?
Having worked at a defense contractor and now at a think tank, there's a lot of similarity between trying to get funding for work at a think tank and trying to sell a product to the government, because a lot of it relies on relationships, really. I mean, obviously, if you have the right product, you can make your case, but a lot of it has, and this is why a lot of defense contractors get the high-level folks in government, because one, they know how it works, but two, they have the relationships with the people they need. And so if you're looking, if you're at a think tank and you're trying to get a grant for work, it's really hard to get it. The best proposal typically doesn't get it. It's the one who knows the project manager. So there's a little bit of parallel there. That's the thing that struck me working in both.
I just realized I need to talk to Alex about how to get grants.
I'm not the guy to ask.
Just want to pull on a string of sort of picking out this sort of intersection between science fiction and technology. One of the areas that we haven't spoken about is artificial intelligence and autonomy, which does actually feature in Peter's book, and I think is vexing the minds of quite a few people in the military technology space, and indeed civil technology space. Elon Musk is very interesting. And this feels like it's coming more than 100 years, perhaps even more than 20 years in the future. What impact could that have on the way in which wars are fought, and how can we prepare for that eventuality?
Sure. I mean, I'm interested. One of the things I'm interested in working on is how does the human removal, so to speak, from the battlefield change the way we operate? And at least one of my conclusions now has been it really won't, because you still actually requires more humans to operate a drone than actually fly a plane. There's a whole lot of human aspect. I actually have met many young Air Force drone pilots who they look like they just came out of a battle, even though it probably has to do with the really crappy trailer that they were working in. And so now you add robotics and other things, I think it will lead to a less personal style of war. It will lead to a more techno style, but the human elements of warfare will still not go away. And so I think even though you may have fewer casualties of the actual people you're sending there, the effects of warfare may actually still be the same. In fact, depending on the ability of this tech to commit the destruction that it can, it may actually lead to even bigger messes that cost more going forward.
But it's interesting that the reaction to that problem of, for example, the remote operators of drones is actually to turn to more technology and artificial intelligence. So it's why we're seeing the high numbers of folks behind each, say, Predator mission is because of so much information is coming in, and you need more. You need lots of analysts. But that's if you approach it in the very old way of everybody watching the screen. How they've responded to that is basically automating the analysis. So it used to be you would watch via the screen a compound in Afghanistan. Is someone going to open that door or not? Now you can tell the machine, tell me if someone's going to open the door, and I'm going to go off and do other things, or target recognition software. Same thing on the fly. They used to joystick it from afar, and it was draining because the plane can fly longer than any human, so you're swapping crews out. The new version, it's not joystick from afar, the system flies itself. The Global Hawk, for example, there's not even a joystick, it's a keyboard, and you basically send it off on the mission. So we've moved from remote operation, which is human intensive, to more and more managing it, to kind of the other way of putting it is you're in the loop to being on the loop decision making. To pull back on all of this, artificial intelligence, AI, again, something that once seemed science fiction, killer robots, the fear of it has provoked a huge amount of responses both within government. I'm aware of at least 3 different groups or task forces that have been created to study this, prevent it, etc. within the military, set up a policy to shape it, this what if. And in addition, you have a variety of outside of military approaches, everything from you've had multiple UN, United Nations events on it, to you have this letter writing campaign that Elon Musk and Stephen Hawking and some 2,000 other scientists all participated in, saying, let's not work on killer robots and AI used in war. Now, what's interesting is much of the fear is driven by science fiction, the Terminator scenarios. The second thing that's interesting to me is it's all for naught. It's not a what if. You know, we may have written a novel, but as I referenced, it's got, you know, footnotes, and we document at least 21 different projects right now where we are already working on AI and autonomy applied into warfare and the uses that we're planning for them in battle. So it's not the, gosh, let's stop it at a generic level. It's already happening. So it's not killer robots in general. It's a plane that's able to take off and land from an aircraft carrier, already been done. A British plane that's testing that already does target acquisition on its own, already done. Stealthy motorboats that hunt submarines on their own, already there. AI, Watson, already played at Jeopardy, has already bid on a Pentagon contract. We're not in this. So my point is, if they want to stop this future, they've got to deal with the real world projects that are already underway and the real world uses of them that are already being envisioned. So it's kind of a way of putting it is, weirdly, the guy who just wrote a novel is saying, get realistic, people.
Come back to that in a moment. We have about 12 minutes remaining, so if anyone online would like to ask a question, please tweet it now. But coming back into the room, who else would like to ask a question?
There's a great scene in the last James Bond movie where he's having a back and forth with his technical specialist Q. I think Q says, you know, I bet I could do more damage in my pajamas and my laptop than you can ever do. To which James Bond retorts, well, how will you know who to bomb or who to target? Which I think just underscores the failing importance of human intelligence in carrying out these strikes. But my question was, a few years ago, the world saw the first instance of a 3D printed gun that, if I recall, the guy had printed it off the schematics from a website that hosts crowdsourced schematics for weapons. And I was wondering what the implications of that are in future war, where you have a rapidly declining cost of 3D printers, which in effect could create a world where every home has a sort of a personal gun factory. And whether that might empower, say, non-state actors.
I'll take that.
Please.
So 3D printing is direct digital manufacturing. I think it's equivalent to what the iPod did to the music industry in terms of this is incredibly disruptive into the very organization of it and who does what and raising questions of ownership and who produces what, etc. A more historic war parallel is Samuel Colt. And what I'm getting at here is, we remember Samuel Colt for his 6-shooter, but that's not why he was big to the story of war. It's that he basically introduced the interchangeable parts and what allows the early versions of the assembly line. And along the way, he redefines an arsenal. So it used to be the military or the government made its own weapons. That's what arsenals used to be. Then it shifts to, no, it's the private sector is the one that makes weapons because it can do so quicker, cheaper, etc. 3D printing is shifting everything from the questions of intellectual property, who owns it, who can make it, who can design it, to more importantly, it allows production anywhere. And as we talked before, space, but also we are, again, not futuristic. We are already in a world where a group of U.S. Folks in the U.S. Navy designed a tiny drone while on board a ship and printed it on the ship. It's a very different design to life cycle than how we typically think of equipment. And so it offers up, again, it's hugely disruptive, big change for war, and tools for us, and innovation and turnaround time. So you can have a weapon, and then I'm going to tweak it and print it out, and it's a slightly different weapon, slightly improved. All those sorts of things. But of course, it's also in a wider variety of hands. So it's not just the idea that you could print it on a base as opposed to having to wait for a factory to make it to you. Some individual actor can make it. Again, whether they're you or I, building a really cool thing, to a would-be terrorist. And we've already seen examples of, I've not heard of it in terrorism, but in the drug trade, for example, using it to smuggle things in a totally different way, where you're able to manufacture parts that look like a car bumper, but it's not that I'm hiding something in the car bumper. It's I'm literally building a new kind of car bumper to smuggle drugs through. So the point here, though, is it hugely disruptive, scary, different, but also huge opportunity. Like every other technology, going to be used for both good and bad.
Okay. What you identified there as something else comes out of your book is that by focusing on a great power conflict, you made clear that this is very definitely a war. I think one of the concerns going forward that many people in the national security community have is this blurring between war and peace. Can you just tell us a little more about how some of the technologies, cyber capabilities are blurring that line, what we might be doing about that?
Well, part of it actually goes back to Alex's point about, resistance to change, is that we wanted to create a context where it had the ultimate stakes. So kind of to pose the question of, if you're not going to change under this scenario, what other, and so, and then raising the idea of, do you have to wait for this scenario to happen to change? And we're already actually, that's been one of the fun things of the book, is that it's actually had an impact where there are certain policies and ideas, including related to some of the technologies that we've been talking about, that we are seeing changes in what they're doing because of the book, where saying, let's not wait for the ghost week scenario to happen. So that's kind of cool. The blurring gray line, as you hit it, you can see it in a lot of different ways. Cyber conflict is, I think, a great illustration of this, where we've seen actors, the very same actors, play in multiple different levels. So Russian organized crime that's doing everything from stealing credit cards and going after banks to also attacking Ukrainian government and military communications networks, and similar or playing a potential role on behalf of the Syrian government. That kind of gray space, and what it yields is really interesting episodes when you see a cyber attack where you're trying to figure out, for example, is this just like when a certain American bank was breached? Is this just regular old cyber crime, or is this something that's political? But what's the political? Are they attacking me to punish me for the sanctions we did because of Ukraine, or are they attacking me as a symbol where they deliberately wanted to get caught, as a, hey, watch out, I can get inside your systems and I could have done worse. So it's the very same act, but because it's in this gray space, it's difficult for people sometimes to figure out whether it's crime, whether it's an act of actual conflict, or it's kind of this signal, like equivalent to a nuclear test, where I'm not attacking you, but I'm showing, hey, don't mess with me much further, I could do more.
Alex, are we prepared even without getting to the 2030s war scenario? Are we prepared for this blurring between war and not war? And is the government getting its head around it kind of thing?
Sure. Well, I think this, to believe that hybrid war, which is the term that everyone's hearing, especially with threats, to believe that it's new, it's not. It's been around for a long time. It's just Russia's doing it fairly well, and we're choosing to not call it out, really. What I think a problem with the U.S. here is we have a very high bar for what gets us involved, it seems. I mean, it almost is contradictory to what we assume, because we kind of go everywhere we want, but we have there's always has to be something happen to us very bad, or we have a very big political governance interest elsewhere. And something like the OPM hack will not, it seems like it kind of should conceptually get us mobilized, probably won't, because our bar has to be visual, it has to be uber political, it has to be extra governmental. And so I think we're still in that mindset, and I don't think we're going to lower the bar, so to speak, going forward. And so is the Pentagon or other bureaucracies planning for this? Yeah, they are. Are they thinking about it? Sure. But they still need a civilian leader to act on it, and I'm very skeptical that they will going forward, at least in the short term.
I'm gonna finish by asking you to give us some homework. Tell us who we should be reading and who else is writing interesting work in this space, because it's a sort of area where you can't get enough material to inspire you. But before I do that, one prior question, which is to flip the question and talk about peace and what do we think are the technologies, the trends, the opportunities that we need to be taking in trying to prevent the sort of scenario that Peter presents in his book, and where, as we go forward, should we be looking to leverage technology and the opportunities of relations with the private sector in order to expressly prevent the risk of the sort of war that you described, Peter? Alex?
Sure. So I mean, I hope people spend more time on Tinder or stuff like that, because I think that'll keep people pretty pacified.
Make love, not war.
Yeah, make love.
Swipe to peace.
Yeah, swipe to peace. Swipe to peace, exactly. Swipe to peace. Man, that's your conclusion. No, I think, as I alluded to earlier, I think we both agree, it seems that deterrence is the concept. It's not a strategy, but the concept you need going forward in order to stop a lot of bad things happening. And to prevent the big stuff, you're going to need those A2AD capabilities. Luckily, the Earth is large. Geography still matters. We've got tons of barriers, we've got tons of water. Whatever you can do to make it incredibly hard to take territory and advance on your capital to make this very old school is still very important. At the sub-state level, there's almost a very pie-in-the-sky idea, but I've even heard this in talking to folks in government. It's to make people happy and happy with America. You have to be very transparent about what you're doing. Let's put it this way. The U.S. will need to practice streetcraft. And so what technologies can you do that? To do that, you're probably going to need some of the stuff we have now, your Facebooks, your Twitters, and I'm sure things will come along for the U.S. government to play to a base in order to make sure that those non-state individuals aren't mad at us. And so you need to make sure you keep people away. Basically, we'll put it, keep the states away with A2AD and make the people happy with you with swipe right to peace.
Peter, what should we be doing now to make your book look ridiculous in 15 years' time?
Hopefully it won't look ridiculous. But I think, again, technologies, you asked specifically about technologies, they're dualistic in nature. So stones were used to, from the very start, both kill other people and build things. And equally today, an example to rhyme with that of a drone has been used to kill people, but has also been a powerful force for humanitarian operations. For example, to find, to do everything from find people who've gone missing in a tsunami or an earthquake, to it can be preventative. We've got colleagues in America who've been part of a project where drones have been used to document property rights and lines in sub-Saharan Africa, which is often a key spark for conflict. It's kind of the unclear where does your property and mine begin and end, and who owns what. Well, you can use a drone to document that in a new way. To maybe some of the underlying issues, bringing efficiencies into agriculture. So again, that's just that example. Or 3D printing, to his question, it's been used. We fear it'll be used by. It's been used to build, weapons online. It also holds an opportunity to reshape trade relationships. So I think a real key to echo Alex in a little bit. There's a combination of deterrence, so that if we're thinking about a great power war scenario, neither side wakes up and thinks today's the day to go to war. Even if an accident happens in that day, a crisis, they still think I can't let this happen. Even if I think I might win it, it will still be catastrophic for me. It's kind of what we saw in the Cold War, where both the sides may have thought at some point they might win, but it never moved beyond thinking this will be catastrophic for me. How do we make sure that thinking holds? In turn, how do we avoid miscalculations that make the crisis moments more likely? And again, I think there's roles that technology can play in that.
Thank you. And so, to my last question, this has been an incredibly rich conversation. We've covered an enormous amount of ground. If people feel they want to learn more, Alex, where should they go? What's your top tip for what people should be following?
Well, I know looking at me, you think I'm super cool and not a nerd, so obviously I wouldn't be reading as often as I do. But I'll give you just a bunch of books. So Patrick Porter recently wrote a book called The Global Village Myth, which I think is very good. It's a book that basically tries to dispel notions that we're this one society connected by tech, that a lot of these military problems still are defined by geography, as I alluded to. The Global Village Myth. I'll read through a couple of fiction ones. Obviously, Ghost Sleep, by the way. But Emily St. Clair's Station 11, that's what would happen after a pandemic, is Green on Blue by Elliot Ackerman about Afghan society, and Redeployment, which is a short story collection by Phil Clyde about what life for veterans in the military life would be. I think they're just brilliant. I promise just three more very quickly. Power Inc. By David Rothkopf, and Steve Cole's book on Exxon, which name escapes me right now, are two brilliant books about the way that business is going about and has influence. And finally, Echo of the Boom by Maxwell Neely Cohen, about how millennials act in a technological world, which I think is quite brilliant.
Peter, you get the last word. As we look forward to the future, what can you recommend to guide us in our thinking as we go forward?
I'd steer people in two directions. One, not to ghost sleep. Well, yes, to ghost sleep the book, but more importantly, to the endnotes. So, we put them in there not just so that we wouldn't get jailed for revealing classified information, but also so that whatever the thing is that was in it that people wanted to learn more about, there was a means to do that. So we should do a nonfiction book. So whether it's his question about space warfare or 3D printing or whatnot, there's a footnote to the report, the book, the whatever on it. The second is I'm going to give a different from books, which is so we use social media to connect, to swipe for peace, but I find formats, like Twitter, for example, as an essential means to stay updated. And so what I'm getting at is basically it's the idea of not just merely what books to read, but what writers or outlets to follow, and that becomes just a constant feed of information on staying on top of whatever the issue you're interested in, whether it's I want to understand more about space warfare to 3D printing to China. There are people, there are outlets, they're all online, and they're curating it for you. And so I often steer, even the military officer going, well, I can't go online, I want to share things. No, you can be utterly passive and just have it be kind of your living online library, your own news service that's feeding you. So that's, it's great to connect with people. It's great to share funny jokes or whatever, but it also has become, I would argue, an essential tool for staying up on change and research today.
Who to follow?
Oh, no, I'm not going to say that. I mean, one of the great things is to figure out the topic, find a couple people, and then see who they follow, and kind of backtrack that way.
So I would very much recommend following Peter on Twitter, and not only because he's a friend of colleague, but he's also interacts with many of the people in this space who are actually worth following and have a lot to say. And many of our colleagues at New America and Atlantic Council, I think, are doing some interesting work in this space and well worth following also. It just remains for me to say, again, on behalf of the Project Study of the 21st Century, thank you very much for joining this discussion. But particularly, please join me in thanking our two panelists, Peter Singer. Thank you very much.